Good to see each of you here tonight. We are going to be going back to our study in the book of Esther. I don't think we're quite there yet with that. No, you're fine. Esther chapter 3. And if you remember correctly, there has been a decree, last that we looked at, there was a decree that was put out, and this was suggested. Anybody remember who suggested this decree that was put out? Haman. And the decree was going to be against all the Jews. And so it was going to be, they were really plotting a mass murder of all of the Jewish people. And Haman, he's the one that put that up, and the king agreed to it. And so we see, I believe we left off there. I'm going to go back to verse number 10. I believe we looked at verse 10. But let's read verse 10 and 11. It says, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And I'm back in chapter 2. So we're going to jump back over to chapter 3. It went right along with it, though, by the way. Anyway, verse number 10, and the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. And so we talked about it. If you remember, we kind of ended talking about the significance of him taking his ring off and giving it to Haman. Again, that ring commonly used as a seal of approval by the king. The king is the one that approved it, and so they were ready to set out to do this. The money has been given, and he says, "Look, you do with them whatever you want to do." And so, I would venture to say that Ahasuerus probably had no idea what he's agreed to. I believe he's clueless and as to what extent this is fixing to be carried out in. And so, as we look down at verse number 12, it says, Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus, was it written and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. A copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. The post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed. And so here we see the publishing of this decree. The publishing, it was, with this, an empire-wide death sentence on the Jews was announced by the king. And, this was just like other attacks on the Jewish people in history, except that they are announcing this well in advance. This was not a surprise. they put this decree out. It was announced way in advance. And so, we kind of come to the end here, and it tells us that the king and Haman sat down to drink. And, when they sat down, he thinks that he's done well, but he really didn't understand what he's done. The king Ahasuerus really has no clue. Again, he doesn't understand what he's done. And so, Haman sits down and thought, he's done well, and he knew exactly what he intended to do. He is well aware of what he intended to do, and it tells us there that despite this, them sitting down and in this situation, the city of Shushan was perplexed. And, the citizens of the empire, you remember the Jews are scattered abroad. The Jews are all throughout the provinces, and so the civilians, they know Jewish people in their communities. They know the citizens that are there, that they don't cause any trouble. They don't bother anybody, and so it's kind of confusing. Why are people targeting? Why are we as a province? Why are we as a nation, if that's what you want to call them, targeting these people? They've done nothing. They're harmless. They're not out here bothering anybody, and so they don't understand why this decree has come forth declaring that these folks are their enemies. And so all this came to pass. Insecurity, and because of pride of one wicked man. And it wasn't even Ahasuerus. That's the funny thing, and I say funny, it's kind of sad. Because all this is being put out with the king's name on it, remember that. All this is being pushed out with Ahasuerus' symbol of approval, his stamp of approval on it, on this decree. And so everybody thinks, hey, this is what the king wants, when really it's what Haman wants. And so he's the one that is pushing this, and he's the one that has set all this up. And so as we move into chapter number 4, we look at verse number 1 through verse number 3, and it says, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on a sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. I'm going to ask some of our young people that are in here tonight, maybe some of them will know. Any of y'all know what the sackcloth and ashes represented? No. Are y'all in the back here now? Huh? No. Mourning. They were sad. They were upset. If you remember, Job did this whenever he lost everything that he had. And so here Mordecai, who is he's a Jew, so he is obviously included in this decree to kill the Jews. And so these are his people, and so he is the uncle of Esther. And so you have all of this going on, and so Mordecai goes out into the middle of the city, and he's weeping and he's crying, and it says with a loud, bitter cry. That's not just somebody going, no. This is a terrible sound, I can imagine. And it says that he even comes to the king's gate, and in his sackcloth and ashes, and nobody was allowed to come. But again, we also have to understand that Mordecai, he knows the character of the law of the Persians, that they, once this is put into place, once this decree was made, guess what? It can't be changed. Oh, man. There's a lot of things we have things that can be changed in our country. In fact, they change them every day, I think, some of them. We don't ever know what's right and what's wrong, but according to them, we do know because the Word of God tells us. But, so he knows that these things, this is, he knows that this is not going to change, which again helps us to understand the bitter cry. It's like he can go in and sit down and say, hey, listen, this is not, which obviously Haman doesn't like him because he doesn't show him the respect that he wants. But anyway, you have all of this going on, and he knows that there's nothing that can be done to change it. And I'm sure there's also a sense of, hey, this is my fault. This is my fault that this is going to happen, that they're going to do this. I don't think he anticipated Haman going to the extent that he was going to go. And so, Esther, as we move on, we look down, there's great mourning among the Jews. His reaction was imitated all throughout the Persian Empire. The same reaction in public expression of grief and horror. And so you move down into verse number 4 through verse number 7, and it says, so Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Hatak, however you say that name, went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. So Esther hears about Mordecai. She hears that he's out in the street, that he's crying, and that he's covered himself in sackcloth, and sends him something to change into. Pull yourself together. That's kind of what she's thinking. And so she sends it by way of this chamberlain, and so he takes it. What does Mordecai do? He refused it. He said, I'm not taking that. I don't want that. And so he refuses to take this, and so the Bible tells us that he received it not. And so then Esther, he comes back, and so Esther wants to know what in the world is going on here. Why is he doing that? And so the king, Mordecai, tells him all that's happened, and the sum of the money that Haman, this is not Ahasuerus, this is Haman that has done this, and Mordecai is well aware of the money and the motive that made Ahasuerus receptive to this evil plan. He knows that Haman didn't just go in and say, hey, Ahasuerus, let's go kill these people, and Ahasuerus say, okay. No, he had to offer Ahasuerus a little something. Ahasuerus was a prideful man himself. He wanted as much as he could get, and so this was a way for him to get more. And so he takes the bribery, and so Mordecai is well aware of that. And so as we get into verse 8 through 12, we're going to see that Mordecai is going to make a request. And verse 8 says, also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make requests before him for her people. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. And again Esther spake unto Hatak, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servant and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether a man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called There is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. So here's Mordecai. He is, what was his initial instruction for Esther concerning who she was as far as her heritage? Keep it quiet. Don't say a word. And so that's what she did. She was obedient of that. She kept that, and so now this has happened. This decree has come out to kill the Jews. Mordecai is upset. He is distraught. He's just beside himself. And so he sends word back. He's not going to take his sackcloth and ashes off and get himself together. So he sends word. What does he say to Esther? He says, hey, here's what I need you to do. I need you to go in unto the king, and I need you to plead your people. I need you to beg him to change this, to stop this, to put an end to it. And Esther says, that sounds good, but there's one problem. You can't go in under the king unless you've been called by the king. Isn't this a funny situation? You remember Ahasuerus' first wife? She was called by him and did not come. How did that end for her? Not good. So now here you have Esther, who is being told by a man that is like her father, raised her, to go in unto the king and plead with him. And she says, I don't know about that, because there's only one way. If you go in, he says, look, if you go in and you're not wanted, he can kill you. Just like that. However, if you go in unto him and he raises the golden scepter to you, then you're okay. You know what that's like playing? That's like playing Russian roulette. And especially with a man like Ahasuerus. A man who is just, you just don't know what you're going to get from one day to the next. And so here he is. He's pleading with her. He wants her to go in and to tell them and plead with them and get him to stop. And that's just, I'm just not sure I can do that. And so they send word back to Mordecai of what Esther said concerning this going in unto the king. Which, by the way, anybody know at this point, it had been, how many days it had been since she had been in there with the king, or since she had seen her husband? 30 days. 30 days. So she has not seen her husband for an entire month. She hasn't seen him. And so here, they send word back to Mordecai. Then we pick up verse number 13. Mordecai is going to make his second request. It says, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? We've probably all heard that phrase there at the end of that verse 14. For such a time as this. Mordecai, he reminds Esther that she can't remain insulated from this decree any more than anybody else can. She can't. There's no way she can remain insulated from it. And he tells her, if you remain completely silent, he says at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. You see, this has given us a little bit of his trust. He's not trusting that Esther's going to be able to go in unto Ahasuerus and change his mind. That's not his thinking at all. Instead, and you get this because of what he said, he says, listen, either you go in there and you stand up for the people and allow God to use you as the tool, or he's going to send that help from somewhere else. You make up your mind what you want to do. Could it be, Esther, that God put you in this position for such a time as this? You know, we hear that phrase said quite often, the right place at the right time, or in the wrong place at the wrong time. Let me just tell you something. If you're following God, you're always going to be in the right place at the right time. And whatever the situation is, God's going to use you. And that's what Mordecai wants Esther to know, is that God's not going to let his people down. If she as an individual does not stand up and does not do, that's okay. That's on her. But God's not going to let his people down. It's just not going to, individuals can let God down, but God's not going to let his people down. And Mordecai reminds Esther that though the fate of God's people rested in God and not in her, that her own fate depended on her own faithfulness to God. Esther, your fate depends on you and your dependence upon God and your faithfulness to God. You know, this whole situation, when you go back and you look at Esther going from orphan and exile for a reason, and she would have to have the courage and wisdom to see that reason and fulfill it. And this principle applies to you and me as well, to every one of us. Every one of us in here, it applies to us. And we need the courage and wisdom to see whatever reason God has put us where we are, and to be faithful to Him. I think Charles Spurgeon responded to this very good, and I want you to listen to his words. He said, "You've been wishing for another position where you could do something for Jesus. Do not wish anything of the kind, but serve Him where you are." Far too often, people aren't even, a lot of times people that say they're going to look something, they want to serve Him somewhere, they're not even serving where they're at. They're not serving where they're at. And so, there's another quote by Spurgeon from one of his books. He says, "I believe that in dark times, God is making lamps with which to remove the gloom." He says, Martin Luther is sitting by his father's hearth in the forest when the Pope is selling his wicked indulgences. He said he'll come out soon and stop the crowing of the cock of the Romish Christ dying Peter. John Calvin is quietly studying when false doctrine is most rife, and he'll be heard of at Geneva. A young man is here this morning. I do not know whereabouts he is, but I pray that the Lord to make this to be an ordination sermon to him, starting him on his life work. I feel as if I were Samuel at Bethlehem, seedlings for David, to anoint him with a horn of oil in the name of the Lord. Listen, I'll tell you this, just looking at this situation, some of those thoughts by Spurgeon. I got a text from my mom on Sunday, and she had texted me, and she asked me if I'd heard who had surrendered to preach that morning, and I said no, I hadn't. And he's her cousin. He's like an uncle to me, but I mean he's almost 60 years old, or is 60 years old. I mean, right around that, surrendered to preach. You know, listen, sometimes it takes some folks a little longer to get it than others. Listen, God, doesn't matter who you are. If God's ready to use you, you need to allow Him to use you, and you've been put where you are for a reason. And so Mordecai tells Esther that. He says, maybe you've been put here for such a time as this. And we pick up in verse 15. We close out the chapter. He says, then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer: go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Talk about some faith. Talking about sometimes you just got to gather yourself. Amen. Sometimes you just got to sit back and say, okay, Lord, you just want me to be obedient. You know what we worry about? I'm sure none of y'all do. I always worry about the outcome before the outcome ever gets there. I always worry about what's the outcome going to be. Guess what? Did you see what Esther said? She said, I want you to pray for me. I want you to be wholehearted. The fasting and praying for 3 days, I want you to be consumed with praying for this situation. It really wasn't as much about praying for her as it was pray for the situation. But did you notice what Esther said? She said, if I perish, I perish. Can't worry about the outcome. Why do we not share the gospel with some people sometimes? Because we worry about the outcome. Listen, it's not my job to figure out the outcome. It's not my job to determine what's going to happen. Because I'm going to tell you, there's a whole lot of things in this life that's out of my hands and out of your hands. We just got to trust. We just got to be obedient. We just got to be faithful. And Esther says, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pray for the situation, and I want y'all to pray for the situation. And so she sent word back to Mordecai. So Lord willing, next week, we will pick up there in chapter 5. Gets good quick, don't it? Not that it